If you saw the sermon title, Still in the Storm. Does this sermon title seem hopeful, or does it seem distressing? And how you see it may actually depend on your mood this morning, how you're feeling, because there are some of you who look at the sermon title and say, yes, I'm still in the storm. The storm is still raging. Or it's possible that some of you look at the sermon title and say, yes, the storm is still raging, but I have a still in the storm. I don't know which way it is for you this morning, but as I look around my church family and other people that we are associated with, Candace and myself, seems like there are a lot of people who are experiencing storms in their lives, difficulties, problems. A lot of people who Satan is not happy that they're trying to change their lives, and so Satan brings those storms. I want to tell you the story this morning about the calming of the storm on the Sea of Galilee. It was one of our favorite stories for sundown worship at our house. Our kids loved the story. We would read it from My Bible Friends, and we didn't just read it, we made it an all-encompassing experience. So we would begin reading the story, and either myself or Candace would be in the rocking chair, the overstuffed chair that rocks, and we'd have one or two kids, depending on their age, in the chair with us. And when they sat out on the Sea of Galilee, we would rock the chair back and forth as we talked about the waves, just rocking the boat gently. But then as we would read the story further, and the winds begin to come, and the waves began to buffet the boat, then the chair would start rocking much more wildly. And then we would talk about and have some sound effects. We'd talk about the thunder. And then the lightning. And of course, my wife or myself would be sitting by the light, and we would turn the lights on and off. And, it was an all-encompassing experience, you see. And we would be rocking wildly. The lights would be going on and off. And the thunder. And then Jesus would stand up and say, "Peace, be still." And the lights would be on, and the chair would quit rocking, and there was calm. Our kids loved it. We did it 100 times. No surprises in this story. It's a fantastic story to tell your kids. But I have to tell you that on a personal basis, I have personally come back to this story and reflected on its meaning in my own life, because I have also had some storms. And thankfully, the Lord has calmed some of those storms in my life. Now, I preached on this story before, and I don't often like to preach on the same story or the same idea too many times for a couple reasons. Number one, I don't like to be too predictable. I don't like to get up in the beginning of a sermon and share a sermon and everyone know exactly where I'm going. I like to be a little bit more surprising than that. I have a goal, and my goal is every week to teach you something you didn't know before. I have a goal to teach you a factoid or look at an idea just from a slightly askance point of view and perhaps generate in your brain a new thought. That's my goal every week. And yet sometimes it's also necessary to review things that we already know. And sometimes it's necessary to remind you of something you already know because you need it right now. And so that's what I've chosen to do in this familiar story, to remind you of the wonderful truth of this story. It's a story about Jesus who's out amongst the multitudes, out amongst the crowds one day. He's overlooking the Sea of Galilee. He's on the southwest corner of the Sea of Galilee. I've been there. I've walked through those fields and I've seen the scene that Jesus is confronted with there. But there were very few people when I was there. But when Jesus was there, there were people following him all the time. Jesus had barely time to relax. He had no time to eat. People were after him all the time. People were needing healing. People wanted to just touch him. People wanted him to teach them. And then he was preaching. And it went on hour after hour on this particular day. In his book, Eye of the Storm, Max Lucado suggests that this is the second most stressful day in the life of Jesus. The first most stressful day being the day of his crucifixion. If you have never read that book by Max Lucado, it's an old one. It's 25 or more years old now, Eye of the Storm. But it's a book well worth reading. Some very fine thoughts. And so Jesus has just been busy all day. And he's been pouring himself out. As I like to put it, everyone wanted a piece of him that day. Until finally everyone had taken so many pieces of him, he was worn out. He was tired. It shows the humanity of Jesus. He was tired. And so in Mark chapter 4, we pick the story up. Mark chapter 4. This is recorded in Matthew, Mark, and Luke, all three of the Gospels, the Synoptic Gospels. But I prefer the storytelling in Mark the very best. Mark chapter 4, starting with verse 35. On that day when evening had come, he said to them, "Let us go across to the other side." Now he's on the southwest corner of the Sea of Galilee. And there are a lot of people living in that area, a lot of Jewish people in that time. But on the northeast corner of the Sea of Galilee, there were very few people living. And plus, most of the people that lived there were heathen people. They weren't Jewish. And so he proposed to get away from the crowds and go across the Sea of Galilee up to an area near Gadara. On the northeast corner. I've been there also to Gadara. I'll come back to that in just a little while. That was his proposal. And so they got into the boat, verse 36. After leaving the crowd, they took him with them to the boat, just as he was, and other boats were with him. Did you pick that up? He is trying to get away. And what happens? They follow him in other boats. So out on the Sea of Galilee, when this storm hits, Jesus is not the only one with his disciples in a boat. There are other boats. How many? I don't know. But there were other people in boats at peril of their life when the storm comes upon the Sea of Galilee. So as soon as Jesus is in the boat, they launched out into the water, and it was a beautiful day. It was late in the day, and the sun was going down, and there was this nice, smooth buffeting of the waves, just back, rocking of the waves back and forth. I don't know if that's what helped Jesus go to sleep so quickly. I just think he was worn out. And so he puts his head on a little cushion. Mark's the only one that tells us about the cushion. It's an interesting little detail that Mark adds. He put his head on a cushion, he laid down, and immediately he was asleep. He was so tired. He had poured himself out so much all day long. And as I said, early on it was nice, but as the darkness came upon the Sea of Galilee, a sudden windstorm and water and rain coming down began to buffet the boat. And as the wind came, the waves came. Now, the Sea of Galilee is famous for these sudden squalls. They sweep down off the escarpments, the hills above the Sea of Galilee. The Sea of Galilee sits in a little valley, and there are large hills all the way around the Sea of Galilee. And it just sits here. And these storms come sweeping down off the slopes of the hills surrounding, and they can be very fierce. And this is exactly what happened. It actually still happens today. And so this fierce storm suddenly came upon them. Wave after wave buffeted the boat. Now, I've been on the Sea of Galilee twice, been swimming in the Sea of Galilee. When I was on the Sea of Galilee, it was a beautiful day, both times. And we were in a power boat, and it was quite large. I was never afraid. But the boat that they were in was not nearly as big as the boat I was in. As a matter of fact, we think we know about what this boat looked like because archaeologists found buried in the mud of the Sea of Galilee about 15 years ago, they found an ancient first century boat, a fishing boat, very similar probably to the boat that Jesus and his disciples were in. It's not a large boat. I've seen it. It's been reconstructed and it's on display at a museum on the Sea of Galilee. It's not a very large boat. And so the waves, the winds began buffeting the boat, and the waves began to pour over the sides of the boat. And the disciples grab the oars and start trying to maneuver in such a way that they can save themselves from being swamped. There's a certain way that you're supposed to enter the waves. You know, you're supposed to hit the waves head on, not let them sweep over the side. But it seemed as though nothing they did mattered. And so the boat began to fill with water. Can you imagine these disciples? Some of them are on the oars trying to row, trying to keep the angle to hit the waves right, trying to get away from the storm. The boat is filling with water. Probably some of them are trying to bail the water out with their hands, or if they had a piece of pottery, maybe they're going like that over the side, bailing the water out. But no matter what they did, the water was coming in faster than the water was going out. And they were on the verge of sinking. Verse 37. It says, a great windstorm arose and the waves were breaking into the boat so that the boat was already filling. They see doom. They are working frantically at the oars, trying to save themselves in their own efforts. But they realize that this storm is so severe, there is nothing they can do to save themselves. That's a very important thing to understand about this story. There is nothing the disciples can do to save themselves. And it's not only 13 lives that are in peril. Remember, there are other boats. It doesn't mention them here, but they must all be experiencing the same trouble, all about ready to go under, all unable to do anything to help themselves. Doubt and fear gripped them. The book Desire of Ages, if you want to read this chapter, it's a wonderful read. The book Desire of Ages paints the picture like this. Already they were ready to give up when suddenly a flash of lightning pierces the darkness and the blackness of night turns into noonday for just an instant, and they see Jesus asleep in the stern of the boat. Is that front or back, Ken? Back. Thanks. She's my sailor. He's in the back of the boat asleep. Now, if I had been one of the disciples, I probably would have looked at him and said, really? We're about to die, and he's asleep? It continues on. But he was in the stern, asleep on the cushion. And they woke him and said to him, Teacher, do you not care that we are perishing? Some translations say, Master, we perish. Jesus awakens. He looks at them. He immediately understands the problem situation. They cry out, Lord, save us, we perish. And here's the phrase in the Desire of Ages I just absolutely love at this point in time. It says this, never did a soul utter that cry unheeded. I like that. Never did a soul utter that cry unheeded. As the disciples grasp their oars to make one last-ditch effort, Jesus stands. And he is silhouetted against the flashing lightning, against the blackened sky. And they can just every once in a while see his silhouette. And he holds his hands up. Now at this point in time, at my house, we were rocking wildly. And Jesus holds his hand up. And he says, Peace, be still. And immediately, verse 39, and he awoke and rebuked the wind and said to the sea, Peace, be still. And the wind ceased, and there was a great calm. Wow. Peace, be still. He turns to his disciples and says, Why are you so afraid? Have you still no faith? This is a miracle story, an incredible story. I love this story. But it's more than just a bedtime story. I like in the video, some of you have seen the video series Matthew starring Bruce Marciano. In this story, in that video, after Jesus rebukes the sea and the sea is calm, there's this quiet period when the disciples are kind of talking amongst themselves. It's like, who is this? Even the winds and the waves obey him. And it's dark. And you can just see in this video, you can just see the outline of the boat. But suddenly you hear someone go, whoop! Wahoo! Can you imagine fearing for your death and then being saved like that? They were rejoicing. And I just imagine there were lots of other boats around wondering what in the world happened. I mean, all of a sudden, that's a great story. But if it's only a story about Jesus calming a sea on the Sea of Galilee 2,000 years ago, 5,000 miles away, it's a story that is long ago and far away. But that's not why the story was recorded. Because you see, Jesus' words not only work on winds and waves, Jesus' calming works on human hearts and minds. That's why this story is told us in Scripture. As a matter of fact, that's what happens the morning after the calming of the sea. Mark chapter 5, here's this story. You know this story too, most of you. It's a story about Jesus, chapter 5, verse 1. Says they came to the other side of the sea and to the country of the, different translations say different name here. Some say Gadarenes, some say Gerasenes. Verse 2, and when Jesus had stepped out of the boat, immediately there met him out of the tombs a man with an unclean spirit. And one of the Gospels says there are 2 men with unclean spirits. Here are men whose lives are experiencing a storm. They are crazy. They are possessed. And Jesus stands toe to toe with them, eye to eye with them, and holds up his hand and says, "Peace, be still," or something like that. And it worked on their hearts as well as it had worked on the waves the night before. You see, it doesn't just work on waves, it works on hearts. And so that's the reason this story is in Scripture, I'm convinced. Because Jesus wants us to know that when we are in storms, He can help us too. Now, I know that some of you have had storms in your lives. Some of you have storms in your lives right now, problems that you have. I won't try to enumerate all of them, but some people are having storms because of health or relationships or just feeling overwhelmed or feelings of discouragement and depression. You know, there are so many storms that break upon us. And as I said earlier on, Candace and I seem to see it all the time. We seem to see it more and more. Seems to be a cycle right now that there's so many people with so many problems. And some of you are sitting here this morning and you're saying, "Well, I'm not experiencing storms in my life." Well, I'm not trying to be pessimistic or paranoid, but just wait. They'll come. It's a condition common to mankind. Satan sees to it that he brings storms to our lives to try to get us discouraged so we won't follow Jesus like we should. If they're not today, if you're not experiencing storms, you will. Jesus said, in this world, you will have trials. But then he says, by the way, he says, but I've overcome the world. We will have these trials and troubles. And some people think that the way to handle the trials and troubles is to do everything you can to solve them. And so remember the disciples, when they're experiencing the storm, they grab the oars. They start trying to row their way out. They bail the boat. Nothing they can do to save themselves. And that's the place we have to come into our understanding. When we're experiencing storms, there's nothing we can do to save ourselves, folks. It's all about Jesus. All about Him. It's all about what He can do for us. When you have storms in your life that seem to overwhelm you, about to overwhelm you, I want to encourage you to not focus on the problems, but focus on the problem solver. Now, I'm not saying this is easy. I'm not telling you this is an easy thing to do. I've been in depths of a storm in which it's hard to reach out. But don't concentrate on your problems. Take them to the problem solver. Don't concentrate on how helpless you are, but concentrate on how helpful Jesus is. Don't concentrate on how weak you are, but remember how strong He is. Don't make your focus on how ugly your life is, but focus on how beautiful He is. And as we are friends of people who are going through storms in their lives, when we are helping them, we should be pointing them to Jesus. We should be reminding them, encouraging them. You know, I've heard people say to someone who's going through a storm, well, just snap out of it. That's helpful. Not. Point them to Jesus, because Jesus is the only one that can help them. Isaiah 26, verses 3 and 4. When I was preparing this sermon, this verse kept going through my mind. For some reason, I thought it would be in the New Testament. I was surprised to find it in Isaiah. It's such a good news text. I mean, Isaiah's got a lot of good news, but Isaiah 26, verses 3 and 4. You will keep him in perfect peace, whose mind is stayed on you, because he trusts in you. Trust in the Lord forever, for the Lord God is an everlasting rock. Trust in the Lord. For those of you whose lives are being buffeted today, remember the great storm calmer doesn't only work on winds and waves, but he works on hearts of men and women. He didn't just work 2,000 years ago. He stands by your side today to help you. And I thought perhaps you just